Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of the CS Education Zoo. I'm Steve Wolfman, and I'm going to hand off to my co-host, Will Bird.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to CS Education Zoo. I'm here with two of my friends from Hacker School, which is in New York City. I've got Mary Rose Cook and Nick Bergson-Shilcock, which I almost got right this time. And I had the pleasure of working with them. I guess it was the end of last year. I visited Hacker School and did a residency for Hacker School was that a week? I think so. And it was really neat. It was a very cool environment, and I've been wanting to get them on for a while to talk about sort of a different way of teaching people how to program or letting people learn how to program that's different from the traditional CS setup in a traditional academic collegiate environment. So I'm very, very happy to have Mary and Nick on, and welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
So do you want to just give us a little background on yourselves and kind of how you got to where you are, and then maybe talk a little bit about what Hacker School is, and then we can go from there?
Sure. You want to go first with your...
Oh, sure, yeah. So I did a CS degree, and I've worked as a programmer since then. I've mostly written web software from my job also, and then about 3 years ago, I was working for a startup in London, and I'd always had side projects that I just worked on for fun, whilst sort of in parallel to my kind of paid job. And I heard about Hacker School, and I thought, oh, that sounds like a really fun way to spend 3 months just writing my side projects rather than only in evenings and weekends. And so I applied and worked on a programming language for very young children called ILO. The language is called ILO. The children don't have old ILO to use it. And so that was my main project at Hacker School, and I wrote that in Clojure, and that was a ton of fun. And then Hacker School asked me to be a facilitator, and so I leapt at the chance and moved to New York, and have been here for about 1.5 years ever since. Still getting to work on my side projects all the time, but also getting to work with other clever people on their side projects.
Is it true you're an alien of extraordinary ability?
That is true, by official designation of the U.S. government. So that's about as gold seal as you can imagine.
Great. And you've done a lot of very cool live coding and very neat projects in JavaScript. You recently gave a talk where you were live coding Space Invaders in JavaScript, right? That's very neat. Okay, well, I hope we can talk a little more about kind of how you enjoy learning through writing these programs and how you enjoy sharing things with live coding in a bit.
Great, yeah.
And Nick.
So I guess there are probably kind of two main things that are kind of salient, at least for this discussion from my background. The first is that I'm a lifelong unschooler. So unschooling is a liberal form of homeschooling or alternative education. It's based entirely around self-directed learning and intrinsic motivation. So basically all the way up through college, I had a very non-traditional path for my education. I never went to school. I didn't take traditional classes. I'm happy to get into later just what unschooling is, but that's kind of its whole own thing. And then I went through a pretty traditional computer engineering degree, which is basically a combination of computer science and electrical engineering. Worked for a couple of years here in New York as a programmer, and then, coming up on almost 5 years ago, quit my job with the intent of starting a company with some friends, co-founders David Albert and Sonali Sridhar. And I'm going to basically condense a whole year of us flailing about building things that nobody really needed and they weren't solving any real problems until kind of the summer of 2011, early summer 2011, we actually started the first batch of Hacker School. I guess I can maybe get into how that actually came about, if that's the next thing to start on.
Yeah, sure. If you can tell us a little bit what Hacker School is for people who don't know what it is, and I guess I'm curious once you explain it, maybe we could get a little into the unschooling and whether or not Hacker School sort of represents a continuation of the unschooling philosophy.
Absolutely. So Hacker School is a retreat for programmers. So it's a full-time, in-person program here in New York City where people come from across the country and around the world to spend 3 months focused on writing software and becoming better programmers. And people come in from a really wide range of backgrounds, everything from people who are 3 or 6 months into learning their first programming language to people who have been programming professionally for 20 years and everything in between. But people are united by the fact that they're smart, friendly, intellectually curious people who enjoy programming and want to get dramatically better, regardless of how far along they already are on their path of learning to code. And I guess the first thing to know about Hacker School really is that the name itself is quite a misnomer. It's not a school in any traditional sense of the term. We use the analogy that it's like a retreat for programmers, in that it's a very unstructured environment. And it is in many ways kind of a continuation of the unschooling philosophy, in that kind of our core principles start with the idea that people learn best and learn the most when they have the freedom to explore their passions and interests. So, since we don't have any sort of curriculum, people come in, everything's very project-based, and we don't have formal teachers. We have facilitators. For instance, Mary's a facilitator at Hacker School. And facilitators are full-time Hacker School employees who are there to help people get the most they can out of Hacker School, whether that is helping people brainstorm project ideas to figure out, given what it is they want to learn and what they're interested in, what's a good project to help them get there, to doing code reviews, to pair programming, to kind of acting as an air traffic controller and directing people towards other folks in the batch. But facilitators aren't traditionally in the kind of teaching role, and they're not developing a curriculum, they're not lecturing every day, things like that.
Okay, great. So do you see this as being related to the unschooling, or is this to some extent modeled on the unschooling model, do you think, or does it differ?
So I think the kind of core philosophical tenets are very much connected to unschooling, in that very much we're self-directed, and we really care about intrinsic motivation. So, for instance, we don't grant degrees or certificates or anything like that, and that's a very explicit decision, in that we don't want people to come to Hacker School because of some proxy. We want people to come because they care about learning and they want to get better, not because they want accreditation or a degree or something else like that. Similarly, we don't have grades or things like that, because again, those are things that become proxies where people see and maybe aren't focused on what the underlying goal really is, which is the education. So it is kind of very philosophically in line with unschooling. Absolutely, and I think Hacker School itself really is a reflection of kind of where we were and our kind of beliefs when we started Hacker School. So co-founder Sonali had gone to art school, where everything was very project-based. There's a lot of kind of just like group, feedback and things like that, where there's a lot of, I guess, grad school in general is much more self-directed than undergrad programs. A lot of the initial kind of paths at Hacker School came from my other co-founder Dave's and my frustrations with the traditional computer science education that we had received. We really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. Enjoyed college, but the focus really wasn't on becoming better programmers, and we didn't feel like the time we spent at college had really helped us become better programmers, because most of our classes didn't have any focus on actually writing high-quality code or writing maintainable code. Everything we wrote was fake software that was submitted for a grade and then immediately discarded, and you never had to worry about maintaining it, and you never really cared about kind of going deep on things or working on what you were really interested in. It was always just whatever the assignment is for the class. So those were kind of some of the first things that came into Hacker School. Is there should be an actual emphasis on writing good code, and you should get feedback on your code, and you should contribute to open source software, or ideally work on other real projects that you're actually genuinely interested in and excited about, rather than things you're just going to throw out immediately, the next week.
Very cool. Steve, did you want to ask any questions? I mean, I'm sure happy to ask many more, but I want to give you a chance to jump in.
Sure, I've got a few I was hoping to ask, but I'd actually just love to follow on to what Nick just said, and something we were chatting about with Mary before we started the show. So you said that the idea of building a piece of software that you're going to hold on to, that you'll maintain, that other people will use, is very important. But I understand from Mary there's also an idea that live coding is maybe a big piece of what you do there, and I'm wondering how do those two fit together?
So I think I've been pretty interested in live coding recently. It's not a particularly big part of Hacker School, though we definitely encourage presentations and knowledge sharing and things like that. And so some residents choose to live code their workshops, or some Hacker Schoolers choose to live code their workshops. Just because I think that ends up being something that's super interactive. So someone can ask you a question, and then you can sort of answer it with code, or you can say, hey, I don't really know the answer to that, let's explore it with code. So I find that when I'm working with someone and we're sort of just typing out at Emacs or so, then we're kind of pairing in the traditional sense of we're building something together, but we're also sort of exploring together as well. And so if someone's come to ask me a question, then often I want to sit down and actually answer it with code, and then they can ask a follow-up question and we can answer it again with code, so that it stays quite concrete. And also I often find that if you give someone an explanation for something, then it's super easy to think that you understand until you go away and you're like, yeah, I've got it, and then you sit down and try and write it, and there's so many holes that you just don't identify until you get into it. And so again, the live coding stuff, or the working together, typing in stuff into the editor, really helps stop those holes from kind of persisting for very long. I did a recent presentation at a conference in Warsaw where I made the thing Will was talking about, where I wrote Space Invaders in sort of 25 minutes in front of 300 people in Emacs from scratch, writing the code in JavaScript. And the idea was to kind of show that all of the building blocks that seem really hard, if you hear about, writing games, that must be hard, or drawing to the canvas, that must be really hard, or writing a game that people can play on the web, that must be really hard, are actually pretty easy. And it's, I think, frameworks that kind of obscure the specifics and therefore the understandable stuff, and make those things seem harder.
I think also this fits in also with some of the unschooling philosophy, which is like, it's very hard to make general statements about Hacker School because it's incredibly diverse, and that's by design. So there is like bits of live coding, and there are a lot of people working on small toy projects that are going to get thrown out in a week. And there are also people coming to Hacker School who are, spending 3 months really focused on, contributing to a single open source project, or trying to get a patch into Git or the Scala, core library or whatever. And so it's very hard to talk about kind of a general statement about, those two sets of people, or any one, kind of average person at Hacker School, because the variance is so great. We have people who are basically from 16 to 60 who have come through Hacker School, and from people who have been programming for 8 weeks to a quarter of a century. And so it's the average there is kind of meaningless. And the part that kind of ties into the unschooling is the rejection of the idea of a one-size-fits-all philosophy, and that we remove a lot of those traditional constraints where in traditional primary education you have education is something that happens at a school between certain hours of the day, and you're kind of artificially constrained to being with people who are plus or minus a year or so of your age. And so the idea with unschooling is to break down a lot of those kind of artificial constraints. And certainly we've tried to break down some of those also with Hacker School, and that we give people lots of freedom. And so, for instance, that's why it just was natural that we shouldn't have like age constraints or something on Hacker School, right? People from all sorts of backgrounds can come. And in fact, we kind of have an interesting case where I think traditional education gets harder with increased diversity. If you imagine a typical lecture class, the best case would be everyone's a clone of each other, right? They all learn at the exact same rate, they all have the exact same learning styles, they have the exact same prerequisites and information coming in, and they all have the exact same interests. And then it'd be great, like you could just lecture to those people and everything would work perfectly. But conversely, that would be terrible for Hacker School. Hacker School would be a very boring and uninteresting place. And again, on the flip side, for us, increased diversity is great for Hacker School. So when you have people with lots of different perspectives and lots of different viewpoints and lots of different past experiences, and people who are, were designing CPUs but now want to learn, how to build a web app or work in a higher level language, and you have people who have been building web apps but feel like they missed out on a lot of computer science fundamentals, and all these different types of people coming together, that's when you can get so much kind of knowledge sharing, and the Hacker School model basically works better with increased diversity.
So one thing I find is interesting about Hacker School, even though you can't say what the average Hacker Schooler looks like, for example, there are certain characteristics or certain things about the environment and sort of certain cultural norms you have. So one thing that I notice is there's a lot of emphasis on, Mary mentioned pairing. So pair programming is very, very important. You have not just facilitators, but you also have residents who come in and spend some period of time, and they have office hours, and you also have, you've worked very hard to create a certain environment. So could you talk a little bit about what the environment is like in Hacker School, and what are some of the things that you've developed over the years to try to encourage this style of learning?
Sure. So the first thing is, I guess we believe that fear is a really big impediment to a lot of people's growth in not just traditional schools, but in much of the world at large, and workplaces in particular. And the people are afraid of looking stupid or appearing ignorant or asking dumb questions. So we have tried from the very start to build an environment where people feel comfortable exposing their ignorance, and ideally not just comfortable, but see it as a positive thing, that you're kind of rooting out, you're seeking and rooting out your ignorance and your misunderstandings of things. Because when you think about it, that's really like the purpose of education, right? Is to learn something you didn't know. So starting all the way at the very first batch of Hacker School, we had a social rule that we implemented related to this, which is the idea of no well actuallys. And so this was actually something we were using internally at the company that we found helped us operate better. It was based off of a blog post that my co-founder Dave had read from Miguel de Casa, who's a programmer on GNOME. And basically the idea is that a lot of times people, especially programmers, when you say something that's correct but not 100% quite right, or there's some little detail off to the side that's wrong, a lot of times a programmer or somebody will jump in and say, well, actually, if Mary's talking about how Hacker School started in, 2011, I'm like, well, actually, it was, late June, blah, blah, blah. That was almost not the actual point Mary was making, and all it does is directs the attention to the person making the well, actually, and kind of creates a worse environment for other people to want to be able to actually just participate. So that was the first rule we had, and then actually the second one we added right after the second batch was the idea of no feigned surprise. And this one really drives directly at the heart of the idea of having a safe environment where people are comfortable exposing their ignorance. And this is the idea that if somebody says, I don't know who Peter Norvig is or something like that, or who's Peter Norvig, you shouldn't respond and say, oh my God, I can't believe you don't even know who Peter Norvig is. How can you possibly be at hacker school writing Python? He's blah, 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 blah. Because again, that has no social or educational value, right? It only stands to make the person feigning surprise feel better about himself and the other person feel worse. And so we've developed 4 social rules over the course of running Hacker School that are explicitly designed at providing basically a lightweight feedback mechanism. And that's one of the really key things about the idea of the social rules, is that they're lightweight. Is this a way to kind of release a little bit of pressure from the valve without things building up, right? A lot of times, there's really minor issues that you feel like, oh, I don't want to make a big deal out of this, so I'll just let it go. But then eventually that kind of, the cumulative effect of all of those things makes for a bad environment. And the idea with the social rules is these are things that we all screw up on from time to time. It's still accidentally well actually people without thinking about it sometimes, and it's helpful to something like, oh, that was a well actually, and then you think about it and like, oh yeah, sorry, and then you can kind of move on. And so that's been a major focus for Hacker School, is building a social environment where people feel comfortable and can really focus on learning rather than being afraid of looking stupid or something like that.
You also have the things like office hours or the check-ins. Are you still doing check-ins? Can you talk about those sorts of things? What are these things that a hacker schooler might do during the day? With whatever project they're working on.
Sure. Yeah. So as Nick said, then the unschooling is quite a big influence on Hacker School, but there's still that means there's a big lack of structure, but there's still kind of little pieces of structure that we think help. So one of the things you've mentioned was check-ins. So that's kind of like a stand-up meeting in a company that practices Scrum or extreme programming or so, where every morning for the days that Hacker School's in session, then all the people in the current batch gather in small groups and just talk for a few minutes about what they're going to do today and what they did yesterday. And the idea with that is just to kind of foster more collaboration, where someone will say like, oh, I'm really stuck on this bug or something, and someone will say, oh, I can help you with that, I think I know the answer, or I'd love to pair on that. Or someone will announce they're starting a new project and then they're looking for collaborators. And they'll find collaborators through their check-in group. I think it's also a pretty kind of easygoing way to get people to take Hacker School seriously. So I think if there wasn't an explicit starting time, it would be harder for people to arrive on time, and kind of morning would drift into afternoon, and then and so forth, missing days. So that's the first component. The second component that you mentioned is office hours, which is something that we, the facilitators, do on a pretty ad hoc fashion, really, and they're sort of modeled after university lecturer office hours at American universities, where the lecturer, as I understand it, I didn't go to American university, advertises to their students, oh, I'm going to be in my office from blah to blah, come and see me if you're having problems with the homework. So we do a similar thing, but people can sort of book in a little time slot with us, so that they're not sort of, they see we're free and they sort of get up, and then they sit down and say, oh God, no, someone's coming. So, and that, I think it's helpful because in theory, hacker schools can interrupt us at any moment, as long as we're not working with another hacker schooler to say, hey, I'd love to, I'm stuck with this thing, or I'd love to talk to you about this thing, or I'd love to pair on my project, or whatever it is. But people are shy sometimes, and I think people like having the appointment for that reason. I think also it lets people plan their day better. And so once the office hour starts, though, then it kind of all bets are off about what you're going to be talking about or working on. And so some people will just have like a 5-minute question where they just need the answer, and we'll just sort of work on the answer together. Whereas other people want to pair for an hour or two or whatever, and that's great too. And I think it's also, I find that as a facilitator, I have a lot of repeat customers. So it's kind of a pretty great way to kind of build this relationship with somebody where you see someone again and again, and you can kind of work on stuff. repeatedly, rather than just like kind of having a sort of hit and run. Hey, let's work for 10 minutes and I'll never see you ever again. To talk to or whatever. So that really helps a lot. And I think my favorite type of office hour is the sort of exploratory thing where someone will start with some kind of relatively open-ended question. And like, I don't know, how does prototypal inheritance work in JavaScript? And we'll just explore it together, just trying to figure it out. And maybe type in some code and kind of do experimental verification, I guess, and kind of build a mental model together about how it works. And what I love about that is that every time I talk about something like prototypal inheritance, for example, which I know reasonably well, then I'll always learn something new, even if we're starting from the beginning, where they'll ask some question, I'll be like, don't know, let's find out or whatever, and that's super awesome.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I was just going to say that one thing I found interesting as a facilitator with the office hours is that the office hours basically meant we were doing pair programming, and I thought that was really cool because I've had many office hours in academia as an instructor or whatever, and that is those office hours are very much okay, let's get the student trying to work at the whiteboard and so I can help them, but this was very very much okay, we're going to do some pair programming, and I may not be an expert in this area, right? So it was very neat. So I thought that notion of office hours, even though it's maybe inspired by the American academic system, I thought it was a very refreshing take on it. So I thought that was really neat.
I think also things like office hours and stuff hit at another really important misconception that a lot of people have about Hacker School is that when they hear that it's unstructured, very free form, I think a lot of times they translate that in their mind to it's a vacuum. And the goal with Hacker School is kind of the opposite of that. Maybe what we really should say when we say unstructured is we mean very little mandatory structure or prescribed structure. So, for instance, office hours are a great example of that, right? Where it's basically a resource. It's a thing that's available to Hacker Schoolers, and you can come to Hacker School and never book an office hour, basically. Or you can book office hours all the time. And even office hours themselves were designed in part from our understanding of how just different individuals are and how they like to learn. So, in theory, there's no actual need for office hours, right? You can just come knock Mary on the shoulder and be like, hey, let's talk about prototypal inheritance. But for some people, that's a really big burden. That's a big hurdle. And they want to be able to plan things out and, prepare themselves, and they're, kind of more reflective learners rather than more active learners. And so the idea of just walking up to somebody and saying, hey, let's pair, or hey, let's work on prototypal inheritance is too much of a barrier, and they'd much rather book an office hour, through a web interface and have a prescribed time. And on the flip side, there are people for whom that is a pain, and they'd much rather, just bump into somebody in the hall and be like, oh, hey, yeah, actually, let's work on that together.
Very cool. So I guess, all right. So now that we've sort of set up the background on what Hacker School is, and it's sort of like the Holy Roman Empire, right? So it's neither hack, for what people think are hackers necessarily.
Absolutely.
But okay, so both Steve and I are coming more from sort of a traditional college environment, and one of the things we're interested in is what can we do in our programs, or people watching this, who are teaching college or whatever, what can we do when we're doing, say, project-based learning with students? What can we do that would take advantage of things that you've learned from Hacker School, right? I mean, how can we do something that's is less structured, or gives students more autonomy, or can take advantage of the diversity we have in the students and things like that. So, I don't expect you to have all the answers to that, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it. And also, even if you don't, I'd be curious to see what things you've learned work and what things you've learned don't work for your years of running Hacker School. Because I know you've learned a lot of things and you've changed a lot about how the school works. So, for example, can you start with what is something that you learned, this just was a bad idea and we had to change it and it works much better afterwards, right? So I think those are, what have you learned from running Hacker School?
Sure, yeah. I feel like this is a tricky question for me because in many ways the things that you get to work on at Hacker School don't really have many real-world constraints on them. And that means that, for example, I'm working on an implementation of Git at the moment to properly understand how Git works. And I'm writing in JavaScript because that's the language that I'm sort of most comfortable in. But this project is completely useless as far as the wider world is concerned. It's terrible, I mean, it's a terrible implementation of something that already has a very fine implementation. But I'm just doing it purely for my own edification. So I feel like I'm sort of in a little vacuum here of sort of I don't know, paradise or so. So I think Nick is better to talk about this.
Well, I spend most of my time just thinking about all the ways we screw up, so I'm never talking about that. I mean, so...
Well, actually, just to respond to Mary's point, I actually think what you're doing isn't worthless at all. And in fact, my advisor in graduate school, Dan Friedman, that is very much how he teaches everything. If you want to learn how Scheme works, you write a Scheme interpreter in Scheme, right? And there are a million Scheme implementations, and they're very high-quality optimizing compilers for Scheme, right? So why write a little Scheme interpreter? So you'll understand how it's actually working, right? So writing a really bad version of Git in JavaScript is an awesome thing to do because you'll learn the ideas and the algorithms, right, in a way that you wouldn't if you just took Git. I mean, yeah. So from a learning standpoint, I actually think that's awesome. I don't think you need to apologize for.
Entirely motivated by learning, I guess is what I mean. Whereas I don't have to build some sort of website that is actually going to be usable or useful for somebody.
Sure. Yeah. So as far as things we learn, I mean, so one thing is we have at a few points kind of strayed from some of our core values. Unintentionally, and kind of not just unintentionally, but like unbeknownst to us, we didn't think through the conclusions of some of like the seemingly minor changes we made. So, for instance, when Hacker School kind of got larger in size at one point, we decided that it made sense to just have like a facilitator assigned to each check-in group. With the idea being that it would be easier for each facilitator to be able to keep track of 8 to 10 people. They'd be able to give them feedback. They'd be able to make sure nobody was slipping through the cracks, that everyone was getting help, all of that stuff. And for us, we just thought about all these great positives and how this was basically, we were just going to shard this and that would be great. And what we didn't realize is that introduced this social dynamic where basically we created formal teachers and that people felt like they were reporting to facilitators, and that facilitators became basically an authority figure. And it kind of fundamentally broke the part of Hacker School that feels so kind of congenial and much more peer-oriented, where people are fundamentally responsible for and in charge of and have control over their own education. And so that was one just minor change that we made that really I think hurt the atmosphere at Hacker School.
I guess as a general rule, if you're using the term shard with respect to people, you're probably not adhering to Hacker School philosophy.
Probably true. Similarly, we actually, and this is kind of a similar mistake that we made around the same time, is we got the feedback from people as we have these like weekly dinners on Mondays, and some people found them overwhelming. They're like, oh, we can do smaller groups. And again, the way we thought of it is we'll have a facilitator take a group of small group of people out to dinner each week. And that basically ended up, it kind of created this like field trip dynamic, where what we found was that people kind of live up to the expectations you're setting. And so if you set up that kind of student-teacher field trip dynamic, this is the authority figure, this is the person in charge, then people start kind of behaving more in line with that. Whereas if you set up an environment where the expectation is everyone here is an adult, even if some of them might be 16 and some of them might be 60. Everyone here is an adult, and it's really up to you to take good advantage of the resources that are available to you here. So that would be, I guess, maybe the first thing to kind of lead it back to the original part of the question is what to do is just think in terms of those ways. I think college already is way better than other parts of school, and certainly graduate school. I've not been to graduate school, but everything I understand from it, it's even more so is that are treated more and more like adults and less like you know, inmates, which I guess is the kind of classic example for high school or middle school or something like that.
Well,
a very
one of the
thing
pieces,
I'd say. I'm sorry.
sort of following up on the field trip or sort of the authority figure notion. One of the pieces of feedback I gave you all was that I visited Hacker School twice. Once with Nada Min, I just flew out for a couple days and gave a couple talks and hung out with people. And then another time when I was like a formal resident and I was on the website and and they were very different experiences for me. Like the first time, no one knew who I was, basically, right? I was just like some random guy who, I didn't know who I was. And it was really awesome. It was really liberating. And no one knew I had a PhD. So like no one knew I taught computer science for a living or whatever, right? So like I could just do whatever and people were like, well, that's a dumb idea. And that was awesome. I loved it. And then the second time I came back, I was on the website. I was an official resident and all that stuff. And I found the dynamic totally different. There were some people who didn't care. Right? They were willing to challenge me on everything, which is great. But there were also a number of hacker schoolers who they would want to sit down and they have like a pad of paper and they would like write down everything I said. I was like, this is not, this doesn't, So if I visit hacker school again, I don't want to be on the website. I want to be like incognito, right? So they're not allowed to watch this video.
Duly noted.
But I thought that was a really interesting dynamic, right? The first time I actually felt like I was a hacker schooler, and the second time I felt like I don't feel like as an authority figure. I felt like I was the expert, right? And that also felt kind of damaging. So yeah, I didn't want to be the expert. I wanted to just be like another person who was just like around learning stuff. Okay.
One thing though, just from a practical thing to implement, I can't remember who it was, maybe at Carleton College, but there's at least one college where the intro computer science course now has adopted the Hacker School social rules. And it might be an interesting thing to try out is implementing social rules in a course.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've got a question from Steve. Steve keeps dropping out internet-wise, but a question he would like to ask is, what's your favorite piece of Hacker School that you can imagine importing into a traditional, a collegiate computer science environment, like at University of British Columbia, where Steve is, or University of Utah, where I am. So given your experience, because you did go through traditional CS programs, right? What could you imagine folks adopting that would have made that experience better for you or more like Hacker School?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's my favorite piece of Hacker School is the interactivity, where it's you get to work with someone else, and rather than like you were talking about, rather than sort of dispensing kind of wisdom from on high, from your kind of super kind of knowledgeable position, then it's much more like a conversation. So and that conversation, I think, starts right from project selection, where people will be working on Hacker School will be working on something that they chose to work on for hopefully great reasons. And then it goes all the way through to them starting to work on it both with other Hacker Schoolers and with facilitators. And then it's sort of guided by learning, I guess, rather than sort of any other goals, like as Nick was talking about earlier, sort of accreditation or sort of prestige from the outside or something like that. And I think this kind of hermetic seal that is on Hacker School most of the time is really helpful for that, because there's loads of other pressures that happen on for projects that also have nothing to do with learning. Just like, oh my God, what is the internet going to think of this? And I feel like at Hacker School people feel okay releasing their projects that they just see as dumb, or project that they did just because it would be cool or fun or whatever. So that, to me, whereas my university education was sort of, obviously the assignments were dispensed mostly, but also there wasn't like this back and forth with the other people really, except for the occasional piece of group work where almost the interactions were sort of prescribed. It's like, and now you have this problem and you've got to go and solve it or whatever.
So I guess I'm going to answer with, I guess, three things in in decreasing order of ease of implementation. Um, so the first, I've already said, is I think the social rules. So I think that would be relatively straightforward, and you could probably just kind of copy directly into the environment. You have the challenge. One challenge there for implementation is that people come to Hacker School basically already buying into it. We already have a round of filtering, and both we filter on this in part on the interviews, but more importantly, I think the people who really don't buy into it just don't bother applying. They're like, that's dumb. I don't want to be part of that organization, and then great, problem solved for us. The second would be more emphasis on, I guess, on code quality. For, the idea just that programming is a craft of some sort. And this may not be generalizable. I'm only speaking from my undergraduate experience, but there was basically no emphasis at any point other than, at one point, I think one professor docked me some points because I didn't have a sufficient number of comments, not because the code wasn't well documented, but because there weren't, the right number. But I just like a focus on writing clear and high quality and maintainable and modular code rather than, outputting the right result to standard out.
Let me just jump in quick. What do I do to get that higher emphasis on code quality? Like one simple thing I can do to get that higher emphasis.
Do you do code reviews?
Mostly no. So that
mostly no. Never in the history of the
we actually care about how the code works. Let's talk about how it goes, and here's some feedback to make it better.
Also, I think with code reviews, then I spend quite a lot of my time doing code reviews and stuff. And before, for the first year I worked at Hacker School, then the Hacker School would give me their code, and I'd go away and sort of lock myself in a room and give it a 4-hour appraisal or whatever, and end up with maybe 30 or 40 commits pushed to some branch on GitHub where it's like, hey, this is what I would do to change the code, sort of one step forward to making it like better, in quotes. And that was obviously a huge drain on time. But I think it was like the reviews were high quality, so that was good. Whereas now, just because that was so time consuming, then I just sit with the Hacker Schooler and just sort of point at things that seem a bit fishy or whatever. And often I find I can't even articulate initially why they seem fishy and what might be wrong. It's just sort of like, that function looks quite long for what it's doing. Let's dive into it, and then we find out maybe there is a problem, maybe there isn't a problem. But there, it's like real time, and if I spend an hour doing a code review, then there's an hour worth of sort of meaningful interaction there, rather than doing the 4 hours of prep, followed by then having the discussion.
An idea I had along those lines when I was teaching at IU, when I first started out in college for a writing class I took, we would meet in small groups with the teaching assistant, and we would all share our essays, and then over like a round table, we'd spend a couple, everyone would kind of critique each other's essays and all that. And I've thought about doing that for code for homework assignments, right, where you have a TA or the professor, and you would have like 3 or 4 students, and you'd all look at each other's code and try to give feedback on that. Do you think that would be helpful? Or would that be too intimidating?
Kind of similar to, so one neat thing that happens a lot in Hacker Schools is Hacker Schoolers just invent stuff to do at Hacker School. So there was at one point a code review Thursdays where a group of 5 or 6 folks would get together on most Thursdays at some set time and go over code together. And it was usually something that was submitted by the group, and there would be group feedback on that, and that kind of roundtable feedback. And that was just all pure into that. I don't know that a Hacker School facilitator was ever involved at any point, either in the idea or implementation or attendance of this thing. So I don't really know how well it went, but they seemed to enjoy it, and I think that was that type of pure feedback that worked well.
So Steve reminds me to get we saved a continuation and go back to Nick's number 3. So what was the third thing you were the hardest one?
Right. Somehow hit at more of the self-direction and the learning for the sake of learning. Somehow removing basically the proxies that exist in typical universities. This was something that I found was really surprising to me in going to college, is that I went into college as an unschooler, and the expectation was I'm not going to let grades or any of this stuff get in the way of my education. I'm going to study stuff because I'm really interested in it. I went to college explicitly because there were things that I thought it could help me learn, and I'm designing my entire college path such that I can maximize just taking classes that really interest me. And that worked pretty well. But over the years, I have to admit that eventually the system got to me, and that I found myself thinking about like the curve or what was going to be on the exam. And so that to me feels like that if the institution is aligned that way, even if you have an individual who's like stubbornly trying to go in the opposite direction, after a few years, it has a big impact. And so some way to, and this is why the implementation is the hardest on this one, because it's the most broadly, challenging one, but some way to remove those incentives that encourage people to think about what's going to show up on the exam, or oh, I add an extra comment to this so that you don't get docked on points, not so that it is better documented.
Okay, well that's your challenge there, Steve, is to figure out how. I think the last thing is the hardest thing to do, and I mean, when I was teaching intro courses, the honors intro courses at Indiana, I went way out of my way to make sure everything we did really was project-based and was open-ended, and the capstone assignment, you work in pairs, here's a basic theme, you do anything you want. But as you get further into computer science courses and the curriculum, it feels like it's harder to do that and still be within kind of the standard academic. If you want to do that for like an operating systems course, right? That starts getting trickier. If it's advanced operating systems, yeah, sure. But if it's basic, the intro operating systems, then it's the expectation you're going to have tests, or the expectation you're going to, have everyone doing the same assignment, and that seems to be the tricky part as far as implementation goes.
Absolutely, and I think that gets back to one of the things Mary was saying about how we have this kind of unfair advantage in that there are these larger factors at play that people who are operating inside of traditional universities have to adhere to, which is you don't want to lose your whatever engineering accreditation, right? That you have these other obligations, and that there is some expectation that there's some X is going to get covered by some date Y. And that's a really tough constraint, and we don't have that at Hacker School. And I would argue that ultimately that's better for education, but it is it's very hard to imagine changing that at a kind of a micro level in a university, right? It's very much a macro concern where universities would have to really change their priorities to make that practical, I think.
Yeah, so I guess one thing you could try to do at a university is to sort of embed within the university environment some of the hacker schoolish thing, right, where you have learning outside of traditional classes and things in the evening, things on the weekends that people could get involved in that are more along this model in terms of being open-ended. And that's something that's really interesting to do. All right, well, I think it's shout-out time. So anything you'd like to say, or any links you'd like to point to, we'll add them to the website, or is there anything you would like to, anyone you'd like to thank?
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks, exactly.
This was fun.
It was super fun.
And for being a resident at Hacker School, we loved having you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me. Although, as I've said, it was more fun when I wasn't a resident.
Okay. Well,
next time I'll just I'll come in disguise.
Yeah, with a paper bag or something, or
that's right, exactly. I'll be the unknown hacker.
I guess if I could say one thing, we're accepting applications for the next batch of Hacker School.
Yeah.
And if anyone,
okay, so that's a great thing. So if someone is interested in Hacker School, what do they do to get in? I mean, do they have to take the SAT, the GRE? What do they do?
Well, I'm a conscientious objector to the SAT, so I've never taken them in my life, and really not to take them to get into Hacker School. So to get into Hacker School, you fill out a pretty quick application on our website. You solve a very simple programming problem, a few lines of code. You submit a code sample that's representative of kind of where you are right now as a programmer. You answer a couple of really short essay questions, and you send in your links, your GitHub and LinkedIn and other profiles like that. We review those applications, The ones we think look promising, we invite to a first round interview, which is a really informal Skype session to just talk about kind of what people are interested in learning, what they'd like to learn and get out of hacker school, kind of their approach to how they learn, a little bit more about their programming background and kind of where they are right now. If that goes well, we invite them to a second round interview, which is a pair programming interview, where it's designed to be as much like they're already at hacker school pairing with one of us as possible. So they choose the language, they choose the project, and they choose the task that they want to do. So, refactor this function, or add this, small feature, or fix this bug, and we pair with them. And if that goes well, then we invite folks to be part of hacker school.
How much does it cost to go to hacker school?
Hacker school is free for everyone, and we have living expense grants up to $7,000 for people from groups that are traditionally underrepresented.
And do they have to apply for those grants up front, or how does that work?
You apply, you signal that you want financial aid on your application just by clicking a couple of checkboxes. And then if you're admitted, we do everything we can to meet people's full request for aid. At the point they're admitted, they can request any amount between $500 and $7,000, and include just like basically a paragraph about why it is this money is necessary for them to come to hacker school. And we do everything we can to meet everyone's requests. And also to keep the process very lightweight. There are no other forms or financial documents or anything like that you need to share. It's primarily done on our code.
When's the current deadline for the next batch?
We have constantly we're constantly accepting applications. The next batch starts on November 17th. We actually still have some space there, so there's still time to apply and get into that. And we are always accepting applications for basically the next 3 to 4 batches at any given point.
And I should point out that, go ahead. I was just going to say that Matt Might, who I work for at University of Utah, is going to be one of your hacker residents, right?
Correct. He's coming, so if anyone comes to the next batch, they can pair program with him.
Let me just throw in one more question along those lines, which is we have a lot of academics in our audience, and a lot of those academics have sabbaticals. Is there any sort of arrangement for academics to come for a week for 3 months on sabbatical?
So absolutely, for 3 months, they would just be able to come as a hacker schooler, and we'd absolutely love it. That would be fantastic. On shorter-term basis, potentially as like a resident or something, and also we're very experimental, so we're open to trying new things. There are a couple of reasons why we have residents. One is to have really great folks for hacker schoolers to learn from and work with. The other is that it's wonderful to have people from a different background who have a different perspective come experience hacker school and then give us feedback on all the things they think that we're totally out in the weeds and doing wrong or whatever. And so it was really great to get all of Will's feedback when he came, because that's really helpful to get a different perspective. So yeah, we would be very much interested in that. So if there are professors or anyone who are interested in either a 1-week stint or a 3-month stint at hacker school, welcome to email me at nick@hackerschool.com.
Very cool. And Steve, did you want to give an announcement about our next show? Because it's actually related to hacker school.
Assuming I can stay connected to the video for the whole announcement. Yeah. Next in 2 weeks on the 13th of November, 2:30 Pacific, 11:30 Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. That's backwards. No, that is backwards. 2:30 p.m. Eastern.
You had one job.
Pacific. Anyway.
Time zones are hard.
It's going to be Philip Guo, and he was a resident or a student at hacker school. I'm not sure which.
He was a resident.
Okay. So Philip was a resident at hacker school, and he's a fairly well-known blogger. He's written a lot of really fascinating stuff, so we're looking forward to talking to him.
Yeah, and we had David Nolan on previously, who was also a resident.
Awesome. Another hacker school resident.
All right, well, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun and very entertaining. And
thank you very much.
And yeah, so I guess we should all keep thinking about what things we could take from this model and apply it and try to bring it back to sort of traditional CS education to try to take advantage of that more. Because I agree with basically everything you said about the downside. I mean, traditional academic CS has lots of advantages, but there are lots of disadvantages.
Love to hear what you try.
Mm.
All right. Thank you
Signing
very
off.
much. Yeah, and
Take
see
care.
you all next time, and have fun. And next time in New York, I'll have to stop by and see what you're up to.
Please do.
Sweet.
Take care.
All right, say hi to everyone.
Bye.
Okay, bye.